Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhaivacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shivaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavad Pranam devotees, good morning. I wanted to first apologize. There are a couple of devotees who have written about particular requests for either an answer to a question or an elaboration on something already dealt with. And my schedule had or has become a little more busy, and so I haven't gotten around to it. And also partly because the particular topics requested by those devotees are a little more elaborate and a little more nuanced, and I don't ever do these sort of sessions in a cursory way, but I like to deeply research the teachings of our Guru Vargas and Sadhu and Sastra, and try to present at least a best of my ability those insights and those truths. And of course, having the benefit of, even if I make a mistake, being able to be corrected by devotees who, out of their love and affection, will add in and say, well, this is something that should be corrected or something like that. So I've kind of held off on those couple of topics, but I have not forgotten them. There was another request for a class that has already been done. I don't know if the class is recorded. I have to maybe become more attentive to following up on those sort of things. Normally, of course, anytime I'm facilitating any kind of class or Ishtagoshti or anything, it's as much for my own edification as it is for sharing and having the association of devotees. So sometimes I don't become as attentive to if it's recorded or not, or so forth and so on. So obviously I have some control over these live sessions, but I don't always have the same control over forums or classes that I'm invited to facilitate. So, but anyway, some devotees asked about a synopsis of a class that I recently did on Sunday, on a Zoom class that I normally do every Sunday. And I also sort of did a small synopsis of it on our nightly phone conference. But many devotees are not on either one of those forums, so there was a request to say something about that class. So that's what I'm doing today. I'm also making an intersection between that class and a particular question regarding sex life in Krishna consciousness. So I think by trying to synthesize the two things, it will give some answer to that question without having to create a whole exclusive topic on it, even though it may be worthy of a deeper discussion. I certainly in the future, if that's what's required, I'd be willing to do that. But I wanted to tie that in to the synopsis of the class I gave regarding Kali Yuga and the influences of Kali Yuga, taken from the 12th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. So of course, in the 12th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the first chapter is a description of the dynasties which will become prominent in ruling in the Kali Yuga. And I mentioned on the class that ironically, the king who becomes the pivotal point in the deepest level of degradation towards Kali Yuga is named King Nanda. So Srimad Bhagavatam is very amazing in that even in irony, it points out very deep lessons. Nanda means bliss. So there are two types of bliss. There's the bliss derived from realization of the beauty and enchantment of Atma realization and the special realization of service to Bhagavan. So that realization of oneself and its relationship with Bhagavan and the seva that follows that is a complete form of bliss. So this King Nanda that's mentioned in the 12th canto of Bhagavatam becoming the pivoting point in the deeper level of degradation of Kali Yuga is irony because it represents bliss derived from the material world. And we know in the material world there is no bliss. In the material world, it is described as dukkaryam ashashvatam. It is temporal and it is where misery is found. I've often spoken that misery is not actually in the Atma. I have not spoken. Jiva Goswami Pad has spoken. Chidananda Atmaka. And then he's given a description of the meaning of that. Dukkha pratyogito. That the Atma itself does not contain any misery. Right? In fact, it is the antithesis of misery. It is the opposite of misery. So there's no misery in the Atma itself. Whatever misery exists within the identification of the Atma with the material energy. That combination of the vicarious connection of the jiva or the Atma with the material energy is the cause of misery, right? Because the misery is inherent in that artificial connection. So the fact that this king is named Nanda is very ironic, but also very instructive. So, of course, in the second chapter of the 12th canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, the description of the degradation which will become the quality of Kali Yuga is enunciated. So it starts with the verse, Sri Sukuvacha. So not only is Shukadeva Goswami speaking this to Maharaj Parikshit, but we have to remember that this is also echoed or later echoed by Sutta Goswami to the sages of Namasaranya who had taken shelter there in the view that they knew that Kali Yuga was coming and they knew the degrading qualities of Kali Yuga, and therefore they had taken shelter at this place, Namasaranya, in order to gather together as a means to hold back the degrading energy of Kali Yuga. And after considering many methods of how to do that, it was concluded that hearing and chanting about the glories of Sri Krishna and Sri Krishna's incarnations, or hearing Srimad Bhagavatam was the best means. So really the shelter that's given at Namasaranya is really the shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam, because all of the methods have been tried, but only hearing Srimad Bhagavatam from a pure devotee. So, of course, we know also in that Leela that Sri Baladev Ji, while traveling to all of the various holy places, he comes to Namasaranya, and there he rectifies the situation that Srimad Bhagavatam really is spoken by those who are Nimatsaranam Satam, who are completely free from any envy and any qualities of material energy. Those who repeat Srimad Bhagavatam under the guidance of those who are Nimatsaranam Satam are also acceptable. So seeing the behavior of Ramahashan Sutta, then Baladev knew he was not the fit person to speak Bhagavatam. So as Akhanda Guru Tattva, he rectified that situation by removing Ramahashan Sutta, right, with the very means of, in an emblematic form, the very means of what it takes to understand Bhagavatam, which is Trinadapi Sunit Chena. So by a blade of grass, he removed Ramahashan Sutta, and he empowered the son, Sutta Goswami, right? And then later on, of course, with the empowerment of Akhanda Guru Tattva Sri Nityananda, Sutta Goswami would hear Srimad Bhagavatam from his guru, Sri Shukadeva Goswami. So it's again repeated at Namasaranya. So after having spoken from the very first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, Janmadhyasya yata anviyat itarachasya artishu abhigya sarat right? This is the Namaskaratmaka verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. It is the invocation describing that Srimad Bhagavatam is the very description of the source of everything in the material creation, but also everything as far as the spiritual creation is concerned. And the height of everything in the spiritual creation is Janma Adi Rasa, means the transcendental divine love between Radha and Krishna, which is experienced Anvaya and Itara in meeting and separation by that person who's Abhigya Sarat or Akila Rasamritamurti, Shri Krishna. So, after describing from that verse all the way through various descriptions of avatars, various descriptions of the glory of the holy name in the 6th canto, the description of the Sarinda of Bali Maharaj, descriptions of the Nishta of Prahalad Maharaj, and describing so many things. And then finally describing the Sonam Bonam of the Rasa Panchadhyay, the nature of pure love itself. And then in the 11th canto describing the very means for obtaining bhakti, how bhakti is practiced and how to obtain service to this divine loving mood, all has been described already. Now in the 12th canto, he describes the anomalies of Kali Yuga, how degraded this age will become. And he begins this description by this verse, Sri Shukuvacha tatascha anu dinam dharma satyam socham kshamadhaya kalina bhalina rajan nakshatya ayor bhalam smriti. So this is very interesting. He describes that the very first thing that is attacked by the influence of Kali Yuga is Cha'anu Dinam. So Cha'anu Dinam means, Anu means to follow something or continuously. So Dina means day. So Cha'anu Dina means day after day or in a continuum incrementally every single day during this Kali Yuga, the degrading effects of Kali Yuga will take place. And the first thing that it attacks is the repository of all good qualities, which is Dharma. So the other things that are mentioned, Satyam, Socham, Kshama, Dhaya, they are all angas of the angi or the root of Dharma. All of these are byproducts of Dharma. So the very first thing that attacks, Kali Yuga attacks, is Dharma. Now, of course, there's the Leela of Maharaj Parikshit seeing the persona of Kali attacking the bull of Dharma. So here, this is literally also being described, and the upakyan or the teaching is that first of all, we have to understand that Dharma is the root of all good qualities. And if you are able to attack Dharma, then you can destroy all good qualities. If these qualities are not destroyed, if Dharma is not destroyed, right, then you have no way to attack the qualities related to Dharma. Like Satyam, Socham, Kshamadhaya, right? Satyam means truth, Socham means purity, really. It doesn't just mean cleanliness, it means purity, right? Because the absolute purity is Anyabhilasita Sunyam, Jnana Kamadya Navatam. Absolute purity is knowledge of our relationship with Bhagavan and engagement in service accordingly. This is absolute purity. So you attack also the ability to practice a lifestyle in which this purity can be realized. Kshama means tolerance, and Daya means mercy. So these are qualities that are also necessary to practice Dharma. When you attack Dharma itself, you attack all of these qualities. So one of the things that we discussed on the class and on our phone conference was that devotees don't need to look historically to look for these things. But you can look right now in our contemporary experience and see these same things that are being described here. I also described that one of the meanings of the word Purana is Pura Api Navam. That which, though being very old, still has newer and newer meanings and relevance even now. So Pura Api Navam, or a Purana, means that. Puranas are generally not necessarily historical accounts, even though they may mention history. They are not like Itihasa, like Mahabharata and Ramayana. So they give lessons, which are applicable lessons, via a narrative that, even though it may be very old, still has application today. So, if you look at the world today, it'll be a better view of how this verse is speaking to our contemporary situation. So, Cha'anudinam Dharma. Dharma is being attacked on a daily basis. How? I described recently, and then I had to reiterate on another class, about the nature of relativity and absolutism. The very nature of Dharma deals in absolute, the absolute truth. And the absolute truth is Sri Krishna Bhagavan, right? Along with his associates, Dham, energies, everything. This is the absolute truth. Satyam Paramadhimahi. And the Srimad Bhagavatam in its first verse recommends that we should do our utmost to become absorbed in meditation on that absolute truth. Paramasatya. Right? So the nature of Kali Yuga is that it tries to attack the idea of anything being absolute. Therefore, it's a direct attack on God. Right? So let me give an example. If you say that people have the right to believe in God, right? It's not a question of a right to believe in God. God's existence doesn't need to be validated by whether we believe it or not. That's one thing. But even more insidious is the idea, and equally, if you don't believe in God, that's also okay. So if the social fabric promotes an idea, you can believe in God or you don't have to believe in God, it makes God relative, or attempts to make God relative, because it's something that is subjective. You can have the subjective experience of believing in God or not, and therefore everyone is okay. But God is not something that is controlled by our relative or subjective experiences. God is absolute. So I mentioned this before, and I don't want to make this too long, but I still want to get these points across, that it's a challenge to anyone who professes that there is no God, right? I would challenge that person, and I would suggest anyone in a conversation. I don't mean any kind of challenge of violence or anything like that. That's ridiculous. If somebody is bent on having their perspective on life, then that's their karmic portfolio or karmic package. But if you are in a discussion, and hopefully a civil one, about the nature of God, and somebody has the idea that God doesn't exist, say, how is it possible to have a discussion about something that doesn't exist? And then you could make the challenge. Listen, please speak to me about something that doesn't exist. From your own human condition, create something that doesn't exist. And if you really think about it deeply, it's impossible, because it's not in the capacity of the human condition to create something out of nothing. Everything that's within the human experience has to be provided to it. There is no such thing as creating something out of nothing. So sometimes people will try to use something like saying there's no such thing as pink flying pigs. Well, you still have not really spoken to something that doesn't exist, because you've just taken three things that do have existence, put them together, and because it's not been in anyone's experience that we know of, or at least in that person's experience, then you're saying this is something that doesn't exist. But flight exists, pigs exist, and the color pink exists. So you have not created something from nothing, or you've not creating something that doesn't exist. So now, you know, if you go to any philosophy class now, and they'll hit you with all the academic sayings of what is circular logic, what is a logical fallacy, and all these different things, it's just a cover-up for the fact that you cannot speak on something that has no existence, because the human condition, the human experience cannot manifest something from nothing. You understand? So whatever has any existence in the world has come from the absolute truth, and we're just bearing witness to it. So this is one way to prove to people, even by logic, if you're in a discussion about something, it means it has some existence. What's the nature of that existence? That's another extension of the discussion. But you cannot say it doesn't exist or we wouldn't be able to discuss it. Right? So, the continual attack, however, and the relativization of the concept or the idea or the reality in the true sense of God is the first thing that's attacked in Kali Yuga. Because if you can relativize God, or you can take away the idea of absoluteness, then there's the possibility to introduce all kind of subjective and relative things according to your ability to do so. Now, here's another thing. God has qualities. Sad Aishwarya Purnana. God has 6 qualities in full, like knowledge, wealth, strength, fame, renunciation, etc. So you cannot, in the same way you cannot remove God, you can't remove the reality of the power of those 6 things. But if you relativize God, then you make the relative presentation of those opulences the default position of God. So this is very deep. So listen. If you take away the persona and the absolute truth as God himself, regardless of the religion, right? It doesn't matter. Recognition of the absolute position of God is what we're speaking about. If you take that persona away or that ideal away, you still don't remove the nature of the power that is associated with that absolute personality or absolute persona. So what happens now is people still recognize God energy in the form of Aishwarya, Gyan, fame, right? So knowledge, fame, wealth, those powers are still recognized. Therefore, by default, those things, when they're seen in relative persons, jivas, conditioned souls, we acknowledge that as being some kind of power, right? This is why people who are wealthy, famous, influential, right, etc., that's why they have so much sway and control over the masses of people. Because they've essentially, though they've systematically relativized God, by default having the shadow qualities, they have by default put themselves in the position of God. Because those who have wealth and influence, they have the ability to control the narrative, the ability to control the resources, the ability to control other things that the conditioned souls in this world need to function. So they by default become like God in their own mind, and also to some degree in a subtle way to the jivas of this world. I'm going to give an example. We pay somebody multi-millions of dollars to keep themselves in a physical condition in which they have expertise to play with various shapes of balls and so forth, like baseballs, basketballs, footballs, golf balls, whatever it is, tennis balls, whatever it might be. You pay people an astronomical amount of money to do that. From the wealth that's acquired from that, influence is acquired, and influence is a power. Therefore, somebody who may not have any kind of spiritual insight whatsoever, now some weight is attached to what they say, right? Because we have given acknowledgement to a certain kind of power, physical strength or whatever it might be. And therefore, people reward that with the large amount of wealth. So now people have an artificial status of having some power of persuasion over other people. This is why athletes, movie stars, etc. are used in advertisements. Because they know that people relate to them in an artificial way as though they have some kind of godly status. So you can see the psychology that if you can relativize God, then subjectively people will still see the qualities which actually belong to the absolute truth in a relative sense, manifest in people with wealth and influence. So by default, they, at least relatively speaking, become like God. And they take control of everything. So this is one of the hallmark features of Kali Yuga. And because of that, actual truth, absolute truth, also suffers. Therefore, it's no longer absolute truth. It becomes, live your truth and I'll live my truth. So now, truth has become relative. There is no absolute standard of what is real and what is not real, and so forth and so on. Everything is relative, because if God himself, which is the persona of Dharma, if that is relativized, everything in relation to it becomes relativized. So truth becomes relativized. What is pure becomes relativized. And because of those two things, because truth and the standard of purity are compromised, then intolerance arises. Because when you have, obviously billions of people with subjective experiences, and those subjective experiences are not all harmonious, then lack of tolerance of somebody else's experience arises. And this is why it's mentioned that in Kali Yuga especially, Manda sumanda matayo, manda bhagyahu badruta. People will be unlucky, quarrelsome, people will be unfortunate, right? So all of the qualities that are associated with Dharma, right, and with those who practice Dharma, when those things are compromised, then the ability to live harmoniously with one another also becomes compromised. And as a result of that, intolerance, the lack of mercy appears. Therefore, you see that human beings could easily, for their own self-interest, their subjective self-interest, kill another human being without any consideration. Just think about it. We've become desensitized, so you can turn on the news and see, 5 people were shot, this many people were shot, or, people have just, done this thing or that thing, horrific thing. Because there's no doya, there's no sense of mercy. There's no sense of tolerance of anything except fulfillment of your own subjective desires. I mentioned the other day, it's completely amazing that, and I'll transition into the second part of this, is that those who are able to create facility for souls to come into this world, to carry out their karmic packages, and hopefully to develop the ability to have God realization. So when a male and female come together for that purpose, now, because there is no tolerance for anything but self-interest, we have normalized the idea that that soul, which is brought by the male and female into this world, can be killed. Even before it has a chance to execute its existence, right? You can just kill it in the womb. It doesn't require that you're under physical threat yourself. It only requires that this is your desire. So I don't have time to go into other features of Kali Yuga, which is going to be expressed in other verses. Perhaps I'll follow up on this and do that. But one of the things that is spoken of in another verse is that there will be the manipulation of words, right? Where actually those who, quote, pundits, right, chapalam, they'll speak in such a way as to deceive people. So, for instance, to create a language that says the killing of souls who are attempting to come into the world, this will be couched in language that is called healthcare, or couched in language that says you have a choice. So you can understand by using that kind of language, it doesn't really directly address the actuality of what's happening. But it challenges that as, let's say, a woman, I'm challenged about my choices. You understand? No one is challenging a woman's choice in any field of life, right? What people are challenging is killing a soul. Not killing the soul, of course the soul can be killed, but killing the soul's entrance into the world to work out its karma. to stop that process is what's being challenged, not your choices in life. So it's really by that kind of language, it sets up a situation where you're fighting against an artificial creation by manipulation of words. Or if you say it's an affront to women's health care, it's like saying if you don't accept the idea of killing children in genocidal numbers, by the way, that it's an attack on the idea of wanting women to have good health care. That's ridiculous. But this is the nature of Kali Yuga. Right? I'm trying to find that particular verse. Let me see if I can find it, because I think it's very... here it is. Panditye Chapalam Vacha. That so-called pundits. And who are pundits? In Kali Yuga, pundit is also something relative. It is not based on somebody who has knowledge of the absolute truth. It is based on subjective categories that people decide who is the most learned in that category. And that will be decreed by what your status is in the relative world regarding what university you went to, what field of expertise that a consensus of people have acknowledged you to be very expert in. So with this kind of ideal, people are speaking things that are completely untrue, but they're allowed to be considered as authorities and accepted because everything has become relative. So this is the lack of doya, or mercy. And all of this is because Dharma has become relativized. So now that brings us into the next thing, and I'm sorry for the abrupt shift, but I do have other things to do. So it was a question regarding sex life. So it's also mentioned that in the Kali Yuga, and I'll go ahead and read that verse, Dhammapatye abhiruchi hetu, that the basis of attraction of people in the material world will simply be based on abhiruchi. Abhiruchi means just mundane physical attraction. There's no investigation necessarily of the quality of a person, but the initial attraction of people is really superficial. Srila Prabhupada has translated it as superficial attraction. Right? So it's surface. And why is it superficial? Because it's all based around self-interest. Right? Attraction to someone is not based on a mutual consideration of serving God. Now don't misunderstand that I'm saying I'm just painting everything with a broad brush. There are certainly people who have come together under the auspices of mutually serving God in various religions, not only in Bhakti, and certainly in Bhakti also. But in the larger population, most people have come together strictly abhiruchi hetu, under the cause of superficial attraction, to fulfill their own self-interest. Therefore, there's a natural maya eva vyavyaharike. It means there's a sort of deceitful dealing among people, even in the most intimate arrangements, which are arrangements around so-called, quote, love, marriage, and all these different things. Because people are strictly operating according to their relative subjective self-interest. Now, those who also, as I mentioned before, have accepted the sort of superficial default, pundraka, for lack of a better word, position of acting like gods because they have wealth and influence, in the Kali Yuga, they become the agencies which facilitate Kali. And one of the things that happens is that in order to fulfill their self-interest, they set up agendas of control and manipulation of the population at large. That's also going to come up here. Malacha Rajana Rupina. That those who take the position of leaderships, they're actually unqualified like malechas, but they take the position of kings and rulers, right? And also, I just want to bring up one other factor which I think is important. That the actual social body is usually set up by the Brahminical community being a spiritual guiding community. But we read in Srimad Bhagavatam that due to the curse of Sringhi and the acceptance of money by Kashyapa Muni to allow Takshaka to bite Maharaj Parikshit, so-called, right? The nature of Brahminical qualities is completely down in the Kali Yuga. Because Shringi represents both immaturity and pride. Kashyapa Muni represented greed. So these qualities are inconsistent with spirituality. So when there's no spiritual guidance, then those who administer the rule of spiritual guidance, the Kshatriya community, is also compromised. So therefore, Bhagavatam says, therefore, without spiritual guidance, those who take the position of rulership, Malecha Rajanarupina, they're only malechas in the guise of rulers. So those very rulers are the ones who then become fit agencies for the execution of the agenda of Kali Yuga. And part of that agenda is to facilitate Abhiruchi Hetu, superficial attraction based on sex life primarily among the entire population. But because there's also a lack of mercy, doya, sex life will now be seen independent of its purpose of serving Bhagavan by facilitating the entrance of souls into the world to work through their karmic portfolios and gradually obtain God realization. So that ideal, which is the purpose of sex life, if you read every scripture, that's the purpose of sexual engagement, is to facilitate souls coming into the world. Now, when everything is relativized, my subjective personal self-interest becomes prominent. So whether I'm not as interested in fulfilling the desire of God, per se, I'm interested in my own self-interest, then sex life, which is the primary sort of enjoyment in the material world, right? That becomes my focus, and therefore I can deal with sex life outside of and beyond the scope of any connection with service to God. And therefore, those who are running the agenda, so to speak, Malecha Rajan Rupina, who are running that agenda, they facilitate the idea that any and every kind of sex life is okay. Whatever kind of sex life you like for your enjoyment is okay. Especially if we can make the agenda such that, because part of the agenda is to keep control of masses of people. Would you believe that it's much easier to control masses of people when there are less people? Of course. Therefore, the idea of creating sex without populating the world becomes part of an agenda for those who have influence and want to keep control over masses of people. You certainly set up an idea where if we can keep the population down, and you can just go to any resource and look up population control, right? And you'll see that it's a fact. Whether it's in, China, Africa, America, wherever it is, all over the world, the idea is there. Therefore, the introduction of birth control, the introduction of abortion, the introduction of sexual activity outside the scope of being able to have children, whether you're heterosexual or any other kind of sexual orientation, the idea of having sex void of the idea of populating the world, that is prominent now. That is part of the agenda of Kali Yuga. So, for the person who particularly asked a question about that, I'm trying to give some description about that. So, under the influence of Kali Yuga, everything is corrupted, including sex life, because it becomes so far deviated from its original purpose. There is no longer the divine shelter in regards to sex life. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Dharma virudeshu kamoshmi bhatashabha. I am that sex life which is not contrary to Dharma. It is not Dharma virud, right? So, if it's not Dharma virud, Krishna is the inspiration of that sex life, right? I don't want to go into more details. There's a whole description in Srimad Bhagavatam regarding all these things about how actually Bhagavan created the nature of jivas with the pleasure potency encapsulated in the genitalia in order to allow the impetus for procreation. Because other than that, the nature of procreation would not be attractive. You understand? So that facility is given to the jiva to encourage procreation. But now, having removed God from the picture, people are just exploiting that pleasure energy that's embedded in the genitalia, and now it's become sex on demand with anyone, anywhere, anytime, of any sort, without any consideration of how it serves God. Right? And you're considered antiquated, or you're considered, so many other things, if you don't buy into an agenda or a idea that any and every kind of sexuality is okay. And I'm not speaking here of people's sexual orientation. That's a completely subjective experience that people have, and it's a whole different discussion. What I'm speaking about is just the sexual energy, period, and its utilization for any and everybody, including if you're heterosexual. Because if you're heterosexual and your idea is that I simply want sex for exploitative purposes for my own self-interest, it's the same thing. You understand? So I thought that I would just call this session Sex, Lies, and Kali Yuga. Right? I think there was a movie or a film many, many years ago called Sex, Lives, and Videotapes. I better look it up because I'm not sure. I didn't see the movie, but I remember hearing that title. So I think I'm going to title this Sex, Lives, and Kali Yuga. So anyways, I think I need to start to wrap up now. But my point was, one, is for devotees to please read the 12th canto, Srimad Bhagavatam, very carefully, because of all the different things spoken in Srimad Bhagavatam, you can make an immediate acknowledgement of how these anomalies of Kali Yuga are directly present in our experience right now. I don't want to end having spoken all these things without mentioning something very sweet and very wonderful about the nature of Sri Vyasadev's writing of the 12th canto. So I had mentioned that Sri Vyasadeva had written everything up to Rasa Panchadhyaya, means the nature of Ras Leela and all the various elements of the Ras Leela that are discussed in Ras Panchadhyaya, everything from Venu Geet all the way to Brahmar Geet, right? All of this has some relation, right? So this is the pinnacle, the height. It is the Asraya of Srimad Bhagavatam. There's 10 cantos in any Purana, 10 categories in any Purana. Atra saga visagascha stanaposanutaya manavata ishanukata niroda mukti asraya. So asraya means the shelter, the final category. And the shelter of Srimad Bhagavatam is the shelter of service to Shri Radha Krishna Yuga. So that's why the Ras Panchadhyaya is described to show the shelter where our service is ultimately deposited. Right? The 11th canto again reiterates the science of how to obtain that shelter. The 12th canto describes the challenges that will come in the Kali Yuga. But do you think Vyasadeva, after describing things up to the height of Ras Panchadhyaya, would then bring the entire Srimad Bhagavatam down by describing all of these anomalies of Kali Yuga? No. The very last verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, Nama Sankirtaniyasa Sava Papa Pranasanam Pranamo Dukkha Samanas Tam Namamim Harim Puram. The very last verse of Bhagavatam describes that even in the midst of all of these anomalies, all of these degraded things, all of this troublesome features of Kali Yuga, right? Something very great is going to happen. Just like in the verse, Kalaya Dosha Nidhe Rajan, Asti Ekam Mahat Guna. There's going to be one great quality. But in the end of Srimad Bhagavatam, Vyasadeva says that one great quality is so amazing that Sarva Papa Pranashanam. So Sarva means all. Pap means all kinds of sin, degrading features, everything else. Pranasanam. Prakrishrupe means completely, absolutely. Nasanam can be destroyed. By what? The Nam Sankirtan that will be bought in this Kali Yuga, meaning the Danya Kali Yuga we're now experiencing. So this verse is a direct look at the upcoming incarnation of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So what Vyasadeva did was he described this very challenging period of Kali Yuga, and then he concluded, but in spite of that, this glorious bhakti that I spoke of, up to Ras Panchadhyaya, right? It will become easily available to those who will take shelter of that person who is coming and bringing Nam Sankirtan that has the power to destroy all of these things. The power to destroy all of these things comes in that praying Nam given by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Chiraratadam nija gupta vitam swanama premamrita atyudara. Apamara yovita tara gora. Even those who are apamara, the most fallen, they will be able to take shelter of this wonderful Nam praying synthesis that's given by Sriman Mahaprabhu. And by that, they can completely destroy the influence of this Kali Yuga. When Vyasadeva spoke that verse, he became so overwhelmed that he stopped writing. So that was the 18,000 verse of Bhagavatam. That's 18,000. That was it. He could not speak anymore. He became overwhelmed in thoughts of the glorious Sriman Mahaprabhu. He immediately absorbed himself, and he himself appeared in Gaur Leela as Sri Vrindavan Das Thakur to continue this writing of Bhagavat under the guise of, or under the auspices of Chaitanya Bhagavat. So actually, in spite of all of these descriptions given about the degrading qualities of Kali Yuga, Vyasadeva himself spoke, still, if you will take shelter of Mahaprabhu, you can completely defeat all of these things. And not only that, not only defeat these things, but you can get the highest spiritual attainment that he spoke about in the Ras Panchadhyaya, which is pure love of Sri Vrindavanandan, Sri Krishna, but more than that, the seva to the lotus feet of Srimati Radhika, or Radhadasyam, Manjari Bhav. So Vyasadeva, having written that verse, became overwhelmed, choked with ecstatic mood, and could not speak anymore. So he concluded the Srimad Bhagavatam and picked it up in the sequel to Krishna Leela, which is Gaur Leela. Jai, my Dandavat Pranam devotees. All glories to Srila Gurudev, all glories to Srila Prabhupada, Rupanuga Guru Varga, Shri Satchinandan Gaur Hari. Jai, Vancha Kalpatrubhischa, Vipasindhuve Vacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai, Radhe Radhe.